Hello, my name is Noah Salinas. My topic was poison and medieval toxicology. So, my primary reasoning for choosing this topic of toxicology, and more specifically, medieval poisons, stems from my own interest in the evolutionary adaptation that is poison. The idea that countless species across both plants and animals have adapted over time to effectively utilize chemical warfare to avoid becoming a meal is incredibly interesting to me. And I have previous experience committing personal research into such species. One of my favorite examples I managed to include into my final box of curiosities is the manchineel tree, widely regarded as the deadliest tree in the world due to its extreme toxicity. It's actually the deadliest tree according to Guinness World Records, which is was one of my favorite book series growing up. And the tree is so poison coated that just standing near or under it during rain can cause severe blistering and even death in extreme cases. So, in the initial modules of the course, when we started to formulate topics of research, I instantly gravitated towards toxicology due to my interest in the subject, but also the desire to explore how medieval cultures interacted with the dangerous side of the natural world. My initial research greatly piqued my interest primarily due to the overwhelming documentation and understanding that many cultures already had on the subject. I was most surprised by the sheer number of remedies and medicinal concoctions that utilized poisonous and toxic natural herbs and even animal venoms, with detailed instructions on how to prepare such toxins for medicinal purposes. So for my primary resources, I narrowed it down to three that I had found in my own research or had been exposed to through the course material. The first was a encyclopedia, widely regarded as one of the first encyclopedias, called Physica. It's by Hildegard von Bingen, and it demonstrates that initial surprise in my research regarding how well documented and utilized poisonous vegetation was in medieval studies. So, in my research, when I had found that this Physica, I was extremely surprised by how much it had recorded on poisonous plants, herbs, and animals, particularly herbs, because there are around nine entire books within the encyclopedia that just focus on plants, specifically for herbology and medicinal purposes. And along with that one, we also, and I believe it was module 6, the Chinese encyclopedia also had a lot of information regarding these. So, as I was saying, this goes hand in hand with my next primary source that I utilized from the course material, the Ben Ko Gang Mu, which I briefly touched on regarding poisonous plants. But then my research started to shift, and with that one specifically, I shifted my focus onto the toxic animals that were referred to within that text. Most specifically, I utilized an example of poisonous toads. Before, I had focused on them talking about all the different natural remedies that they utilize poisonous plants in. I believe my discussion and assignments related to that module and that specific text were almost entirely focused on the different poisonous plants that they talked about, as well as how there were dozens of different ways to prepare them, to identify them, and to use them for medicinal purposes. But on a second look through later for this final project here, I actually managed to stumble on upon their detailings of poisonous or venomous toads. They use that terminology somewhat interchangeably, which will actually lead me into the primary focus of my study. Uh, My final written primary resource was the Book of Antidotes, which that one I found in my own research. So this resource was the most interesting to me as it actually somewhat shifted my course of action and how I curated my cabinet, but also it shifted my area of research as I had initially started out just at the beginning of this semester. I was primarily looking into anything poison related with an intense focus on people brewing poisons. I was more interested in the side of medieval studies that was almost in witchcraft and people brewing poisons for nefarious purposes, that kind of thing. But I realized very early on that there weren't too many primary sources that dealt with that. Um, it was more likely that interest was spiked by pop culture references and those kinds of things, with things being blown out of proportions and not historically accurate. But I found myself realizing that poison and venom was not necessarily a distinct topic of discussion in medieval toxicology. And I primarily realized this reading the Book of Antidotes and researching about that, as well as the references to these poisonous toads, as in uh, the Ben Cow Gang Moo. That toad is there are multiple toads throughout that are referenced as poisonous or venomous, and there are instances within the text where that word is utilized. A toad is called poisonous, and then in the next sentence is called venomous. And so I started to shift my focus into how medieval people viewed poison, as well as how that viewpoint changed how they used it. And so within the Book of Antidotes, this resource was the most interesting to me as it actually some as it was the most interesting to me because it focused on the practice of theratic, which is remediating and utilizing snake venom in medicine. So not only did this resource provide me with a totally unique study of medieval toxicology that I had not previously considered, but it also demonstrated how the terms venom and poison were inconsistently utilized throughout cultures, as it, among other primary sources, frequently refers to snakes and other animal bites as poisonous. So this had me thinking along the lines of whether or not the terminology and distinction was lacking, and if that also meant that medieval scholars did not fully understand how venom and poison entered the body differently. However, through further research along these lines, I came to the understanding that either the translations were lacking or these medieval scholars did not necessarily deem the distinction necessary for the purposes of their work, as the majority of the primary sources dealt with how to treat the negative side effects of poison and venom. So the particular vernacular distinction is somewhat of a moot point, because when you've got a snake bite, it doesn't matter if someone's referring to it as poison or venom. All that matters is that you know how to treat it. As well, it can likely be inferred that there was a significant degree of understanding in venom needing to be injected into the blood while poison needed to be absorbed or ingested, as the majority of medieval toxicology also demonstrated enough understanding of such toxins so as to allow them to provide detailed instructions of how to prepare toxic things for medicine. So the rest of my primary resources beyond the two course materials and then also my own finding of the Book of Antidotes, the rest of those were images that I primarily found through the discussion where we utilized the online database JSTOR. And I just sprinkled in those images throughout, with including There's sources as well as detailed explanations of what they are, most of which are just a few pictures or illustrations of plants from medieval encyclopedias. And then I followed those up with just brief little tidbits about what those plants are that can be found in a common encyclopedia regarding plants. So, from what I saw, not only in my research, but also in the work of my peers over the semester, medieval toxicology is a relatively popular field of study. Most historians focus on the herbology and medicinal application of toxic plants and animal byproducts, keying into the vast collection of medicinal and herbal encyclopedias that discuss the plethora of poisonous plants and animals, which is once again referring to my primary resources. Those were beyond the book of antidotes, those were largely just encyclopedias of knowledge that and almost anything and everything detailing poisoning or how to deal with that. It was all relative to a medicinal field of study where poisonous plants were documented, but the majority of the text was regarding how to detect them as well as how to treat the symptoms if ingested. And in most cases, especially in the gang, the Ben Cow Gang Moo, that one especially, poisonous plants were widely regarded in terms of how to collect them as well as prepare them for their medicinal benefits. So, medieval toxicology is primarily concerned with how medieval people documented the deadly natural world around them, as well as how they adapted to and utilized such things medicinally. Once again, I'm emphasizing how the majority of medieval studies into toxicology, is based in the medicinal applications of otherwise toxic materials. And so, in my own research, I instead focused on how medieval toxicology was a broad study of not only poisons but venoms, and how the distinction was not necessarily relevant. My own research evolved into analyzing what poison meant to scholars and scientists aiming to understand the deadly natural world, which led me to understanding that the very word poison across cultures does not necessarily translate to the scientific understanding of a toxin that must be ingested or absorbed through orifices to be effective. But instead, poison was the broader terminology for anything naturally capable of killing humans without physical violence like bears or wolves. So, my research also included how poison was not only studied and used medicinally, but how medieval peoples utilized it for its intended natural purpose, killing things. One of the most notable things I realized throughout my research was constant references to how poisons were used by people on people. If I discovered a certain poisonous plant recorded in one of my primary sources, a few hours of research into its history and discovery inevitably led to examples of, of kings, queens, philosophers, and everything in between dying from poison related to said plant. For example, one of the first and most notable plants that I found in all of my research was hemlock. It's a widely known poisonous plant. It's highly toxic to humans, especially if ingested raw. And the majority of information I found when I was looking across databases, not necessarily the primary resources, but in my studies into hemlock, what it looks like, what it is, the Latin wording and representation, I always seem to stumble into references of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates and how after his trial in, I believe it was Athens, he was then ordered to execute himself by drinking a cup of hemlock. And so, beyond that, most interestingly, I also found references to birds detecting poison for kings in their palaces, specifically in another one of our discussion modules, the 11th century Egyptian Guide to the Universe, the Book of Curiosities. Here, poison was indirectly mentioned, with the focus instead being on defense against poisoning and the context of Indian kings utilizing these birds in their palaces infers that such kings had reason to fear poisoning. So, to summarize, the primary difference in my research is that I focused on how medieval people viewed poison and the deadly natural world. While mainstream medieval toxicology studies focus on the medicinal, I attempted to understand the connotations and reasonings for utilizing poison across the broad spectrum it exists, from medicinal purposes to rodent repellent. And so within my actual cabinet of curiosities, I opted to curate it starting with a broad description of what poison is and how it was codified within medieval scripts. And then I started with notable examples, particularly plants. Here we can see the images of nightshade, as well as I had just previously mentioned, hemlock. And so I included these poisonous plants because these are two of the most notorious and well known. And just along with them, brief descriptions of them, as well as the references to Socrates. Then here's the first inclusion of one of my primary sources, which was the Physica, which is a 12th century encyclopedia, and it was a broad expanse of medicinal knowledge with 9 entire books focusing on plants and their medicinal values, with a significant amount of information on poisonous plants and how they can not only be remedied if accidentally ingested, but also prepared in a way that gives them medicinal value. And so then I tie that into the Ben Cow Gang Moo, because that one also was another encyclopedia that included a plethora of knowledge on toxic plants. That one was much more focused on remedies and how to use otherwise toxic plants medicinally. And from there, I transitioned into poisonous animals, and I included quotation marks around this because this is where my research and my cabinet shifts into that idea that poison is a much broader idea than what what poison scientifically is. And so my first reference is to the Book of Antidotes, my other primary research, and here's a page out of it that includes different depictions of snakes. And within that book, they actually discuss not only how to capture and hold snakes, but how to milk them for their venom to be used then for anti-venoms as well as treating other sicknesses and disease, which is that niche study regarded as thoratic, which is that remediation and utilization of snake venom. And from there, I once again referenced the Ben Cow Gang Moo, this time going into their reference to the toads. Within those texts, toads are referred to as poisonous as well as having venom, which, while they utilize that word venom, toads do not actually have venom, as the secretion that the Ben Cow Gang Moo is detailing here is actually a toxin. It's a poison they secrete, and it has to be absorbed through the skin or, as noted here, by the eyes. And it's very interesting because in this document, they take special care to warn people that if they are going to try and harvest this toxin, that they should absolutely avoid letting it get into their eyes, as it can blind them if their eyes are not thoroughly washed almost immediately. And from there, I then jump into how poison is a weapon. Here, I actually found a pretty beautiful stained glass depiction of a woman bringing poison to try and kill Saint Germain of Paris. So this piece is currently on display at the Met as part of their Cloisters collection, and the majority of pieces at the Met are actually in the public domain, so this was a pretty great find for me. And so from here, I discussed how poison has been utilized across the world for a tool for warfare, whether it's politically motivated through secret poisonings or also on the battlefield. Um, One of the more interesting areas of research that I came across, which I had already had an understanding of before this course, I don't exactly remember where I had first heard of this, but it was through my interest in that manchineel tree that I had been aware of thanks to the Guinness World Record book I had read decades before, um, detailing this highly toxic tree. And through my own understanding and research into that tree, I was able to find accounts of Spanish conquistadors who, when invading South America as well as the Caribbean and Florida, where that tree can be found, the indigenous people there were coating their spears, their arrowheads, as well as blow darts in that toxin, which is regarded to have, or is believed to have been what killed Juan Ponce de Leon, who is a very infamous conquistador. And so then I also included a picture of Juan de Leon. And then here I found a rather interesting ring. This was also through that JSTOR imagery. And this ring demonstrates that subversive potential of poison in the political realm, as the coiled snake here features a hollow frame with these perforations near the top, allowing someone to discreetly administer poison to a cup by simply turning their finger downwards, allowing the poison to fall out of the hollowed out ring. And so then I finish it up with preventive measures that go beyond the herbology and encyclopedias that detail how to deal with poisons. And this is where I bring in that other primary resource that I found through the course material, the Book of Curiosities. Um, so here I detail the 3 different birds that were referenced to having been associated with royalty, as they were able to detect poisons in different ways that would then alert people that there was something on their plate that had been tampered with or was not safe to eat. And then, as well as that, I also discuss how poison is not only a preventative, how people prevented against being poisoned, but also how poison is used as a preventative for things such as rodents and bugs. With this image here of the rat poison peddler, which I also found in the JSTOR catalog. So then I finish up with a statement: across time and cultures, humans have had a knack for understanding the potential dangers of the natural world, including the toxicology of the plants and animals around them. But ever curious, we have found ways to utilize the dangerous side of nature, whether it be as a weapon or medicine. And then I have all my work cited here, as well as the image citations in chronological order. For the stained glass, I simply included a link as that is in the public domain, which was the same for the unverified portrait of Juan Ponce de Leon I included. Both of those images were in the public domain, so I just included the links where I found them. And that wraps up my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you.